Hello and welcome to this video on contribution and break-even. So far we've been looking at the finances of our business. There we go, there's our little business and a pound sign. And so far we've looked at money the business has received, which we call revenue, and money the business spends on producing the products, which we call costs. In today's video, we're going to extend this analysis a little bit further and start to look at a concept called contribution, and also look at the situation where revenue is the same as the costs, which we call break-even. So in this video, we're going to look at what is meant by contribution and break-even, and again, we're going to do some calculations. Don't panic, the maths is quite simple. You just have to follow the formula, plug in the numbers, and interpret the results. Everyone can nail this topic. So first of all, let's start off with contribution. What does the word contribution mean, and how can we apply it to a business situation? Well, the word contribution means, if you think about it, when you contribute, you give towards something. And the same idea applies in business. So in business, whenever a product is sold or a service is provided, what does that money contribute towards? What does the money generated go towards covering? Well, in the first instance, the money generated from selling the product goes towards paying off the variable costs. The costs involved in the actual making of the item. The raw materials, for example. And then once those costs have been paid off, then that money can start to contribute towards the rest of the costs of the business, or the fixed costs, things like the rent or the heating, for example. And once there are enough contributions to cover all the costs, then the business can start to make a profit. This idea of contribution is probably best illustrated using an example. And in our example, we're going to think about a pen. Here it is, very fine pen it is. And in our stationers, we sell the pen for 88p. That is the price that customers pay for the pen. So the first thing to consider when we think about how much does each pen contribute is to say, well, what are the variable costs involved in making the pen? So if we think of the variable costs, the actual costs involved in producing the item, the plastic, the ink, the little bits of metal and so on, if we say that those costs are 47p, then how much is contributed when we sell a pen? How much is the pen itself contributing towards the costs of the rest of the business? Well, the contribution per unit, or the contribution from each pen, would be 41p. The 88p minus 47p. And what does that money generated contribute towards? Well, that money, that contribution, would start to go towards covering the rest of the costs, not the variable costs that have been included within the pen, but the rest of the costs of the business, i.e. the fixed costs. And once we've built up enough little contributions from each of the units that we've sold, eventually if the contributions cover all the fixed costs, then whatever is left over would be our profit. So what have we established so far? We've established contribution per unit. And contribution per unit is the selling price per unit minus the variable cost per unit. And that is the formula we can use to calculate it, and is an important formula to take down in your notes. So for example, if variable cost was 47p per unit for our pen, and the product sells for 88p, the contribution per unit is 41p. Now we would hope in our business selling pens that we sell more than just one pen. In fact, we'd hope we sell a lot of pens. So how can we work out the total contribution? How much money has been generated from all of the pens that we sell? Well, there are two approaches here to calculating the total contribution. The first method is to say, well, what was the contribution per item or per unit? In our example, it was 41p. And we can multiply that by how many units have been sold. And that would give us the total amount of money that has been contributed before paying off fixed costs. A second approach to working that out would be to say, what is the total revenue? How much money have we received in total from selling the pens? And then subtract the variable costs that we've spent as a business. For example, the cost of the ink and the plastic and the metal and so on. Now, both these approaches will give us the same answer, and we can use whichever one we think is most appropriate. So let's look at an example. Let's imagine a scenario. Let's take the Esher College canteen, for example, and imagine that they're manufacturing delicious cupcakes. And each week they sell 500 cupcakes. and the price they charge is a very reasonable £1.10, and the variable costs of each cupcake, i.e. the cost of all the flour and the icing and the sprinkles and the little bit of flake you see sticking out the top there, those costs all add up to 50p. So the first question would be, well, each time Esher College sell one cupcake, what is the contribution? What is the contribution per unit? Well, contribution per unit, the formula that we should have written down, is selling price minus variable cost per unit. In this instance, £1.10 is the selling price, subtract the variable cost, so each cupcake generates 60 pence. Each cupcake generates 60 pence towards the other costs of the business. But we don't sell just one cupcake. No, we're a hungry lot here. We've sold 500. So what would be the total contribution? Well, the total contribution, we can use method 1 to start off with. And the total contribution is the contribution per unit multiplied by the number of units sold. And our contribution per unit, we've calculated as 60p. And if we sell 500 cupcakes, our total contribution, £300. The college canteen has generated £300 before paying off any fixed costs. We can cross-check this. We can look at method 2, total revenue minus variable costs. The total revenue, well, total revenue we learnt is price times quantity, so £1.10 times 500 gives us £550. Subtract the total variable costs, 50 pence is the variable cost per unit, multiplied by 500 units of cupcakes, £250. 550 minus 250 gives us £300. The answer is the same. We would expect that. These are two methods just to get to the same answer, and we can use whichever one we think is the best approach. So the college canteen has generated £300 towards covering the rest of the costs of the business, i.e. the fixed costs. So what would this mean for the college canteen if the fixed costs per week were actually £200? Well, they've generated £300 to cover the cost of £200. So can you work out what it would mean for the college? That's right. It would mean they would be making a profit, happy days, of £100. So contribution is significant because it helps us work out the profit. So profit we can calculate by taking the total contribution and subtracting the remaining fixed costs. And again, this is a formula we should have down in our notes. Looking at that formula, if the total contribution is bigger than the fixed cost, the business is making a profit, happy days. However, if the fixed costs are bigger than the total contribution, the business would be making a loss. Not happy days, sad days. Now a firm will break even, not make a profit, not make a loss, if the total contribution is equal to the fixed costs. And this concept is an important concept, and we're going to look at it next. Break even. And the picture of the scales in the background are quite appropriate metaphor for this topic. Break even for a business is when the total revenue equals the total costs. Imagine a situation where a business has received, say, £400 in revenue from its customers, but has spent £400 as well on the costs of running the business. Now, in that situation, ask yourself, has that business made a profit? Has that business made a loss? Well, if the profit is zero, there is no profit or loss, we describe that situation for the business financially as break even. That business has reached break even. It's also the same as saying the total contribution is equal to the fixed costs. So break even is where total revenue equals total costs. And what we're very interested in business is working out the break even output. The level of output, or how many units the business has to sell, at which point revenue is equal to costs. So for my pen business, for example, how many pens do we need to sell so that we reach break even? So a business will do this. It will analyze what is the break even level of output. It's important for a business to know that. Most new businesses, when they start out, just want to survive. And to survive, you really need to avoid making a loss. And to not make a loss, you need to reach break even as soon as possible. So this is a really key number for businesses. How many items do we need to sell this year to break even? And then they can ask, is it realistic? Is it not? And so on. Now we can calculate the break even output by using this formula below. Before we get to the formula, let's consider a little scenario. Let's imagine that we ran a t-shirt manufacturing business and the fixed costs for our business were £15,000. The cost of the premises, the machines, the irons, doing a bit of marketing, that kind of stuff. And we're going to sell our t-shirts for a very reasonable £11.50, and it costs us, the variable cost per unit are £4 per t-shirt. Now, if you were starting this business, I might fairly legitimately say to you, well, how many t-shirts do you need to sell this year to break even? And if you hadn't studied business, you might go, not sure, I could try and have a go at working it out, let me get back to you. Now, you could possibly go away and start to try and calculate randomly, trial and error, and to see if fixed costs equal this and so on, and try and work out the break-even point. So you might draw up a table for your t-shirts, and you might say, right, if we sold no t-shirts, what are the fixed costs, what are the variable costs, what are the total costs, does it match the revenue? No, we haven't reached break-even. Okay, let me try another calculation. If we make 1,000 t-shirts, what are the total costs, what are the revenue, have we broke even? No, and so on. It might take quite a long time. So what we can do as business students is actually we can use this formula here and very quickly work out what the break-even output is. So this is a very important formula and one we need to get familiar with and we need to learn. So let's have a go at using it. In our scenario, the fixed costs are £15,000. We can plug that in. The selling price is £11.50 and the variable costs are £4. So with that information, we could work out the contribution per unit is £7.50. So how many t-shirts would the business have to sell to break even? If we use the formula, fixed costs divided by contribution per unit, we get an answer of 2,000, and that means 2,000 t-shirts. Our business would have to sell 2,000 t-shirts to reach a situation where revenues equals costs. Lots of t-shirts. And again, we can go back to this little table and just check that's the case. If we sell 2,000 t-shirts, total cost of £23,000, total revenue is £23,000. So yes, that is break even, zero profit, and the break even output is 2,000 t-shirts. Now this is a really important formula and it's really vital that we learn this as soon as possible. Fixed costs divided by contribution per unit equals break even output. So fixed costs, FC, and I always think to myself, FC, football club, and there's a very good football club there. Divided by contribution, CPU, and CPU reminds me of computer. So if I think to myself, break-even output, football club, computer, FC divided by CPU, fixed costs divided by contribution per unit, it sounds random, it sounds weird, but it's a really excellent way to memorize this formula. So there we go. We've looked at what is meant by contribution, total contribution, contribution per unit, the significance of contribution, and we've also looked at break-even. What is break-even output, and we've looked at the calculations. We should now be able to have a go at these calculations, contribution and break-even output, and they shouldn't, fingers crossed, cause us too much stress. So this is the key information, the key formula that we should have taken from this video. Again, it's worth checking in your notes and make sure you've got down these 7 important bits of information before we try and apply them in class. So that's it. That's contribution and break even.